Hello, we're gonna paint this little lakeside painting. It's gonna be a seat of your pants, in other words, no pencil drawing. Gonna start out dividing 1/3, 2/3 between the lake reflection and the rest of the scenery. A pencil drawing here would get in our way because we're gonna use a lot of back runs and wet into wet techniques, and those don't like to follow pencil lines. So I'm going to start with the sand as just a dividing point. Next, I'm going to lay in the middle ground cliffs, and these are going to be painted with non-staining pigments because we're going to lay in the aspen trees and their color will push the background color out of the way. And we're going to use the background effect, very wet, and it's going to do some of the work of creating an impression of foliage for us. One of the things about watercolor is its fluidity, and I always like to take advantage of that in my paintings. Okay, the right hand cliff next. Once again, non-staining colors for the background. We'll get that in there wet. Add color variations as I go. And then when we lay in the trees, their color will push the background color aside. Backgrounds are a wonderful property of watercolor. In this painting, you're going to see me use all 4 of the brush paper relationships. And I think if you're going to paint a watercolor, you should take advantage of all those relationships. Here we go with the tree colors, and you can see them pushing aside the background color, and the edge can be interpreted as foliage once we put in the trunks. Kind of the abstraction created by the background will be interpreted as a tree once it has a trunk threading through it. I'm switching to a smaller brush to add backgrounds on the interior of the trees, and that'll kind of help give the illusion of depth into the tree. You notice I'm working on the trees that have somewhat dried first. So the ones that we painted initially, I took the smaller brush and added the colors into them. So the amount of water and the timing on the trees is important. Now we're going to add a darker forest behind the aspen trees, and that should really help their color and value pop against the darker forest. Notice I'm keeping it very wet, and I want the colors in the darker forest trees to run, and you'll also see me tilt the paper later on when we do the bigger trees, and I'll lay some other colors into those and let them run downward and into the rest of the group of the forest trees, just to add color variation and interest. Here I'm varying the color of this tree, and I'll also be charging some other colors into it for color variation, as well as some run effects within the shape of the tree. Here we go, tree trunk magic. I'm using some titanium white acrylic. A lot of times I would paint negatively around this, but with the runny backgrounds, you can't really do it effectively. So I'm just using some white acrylic just for the tree trunks. Later on, we'll paint some color over that after it dries. And this is where our backgrounds start to look like trees, just because we add a trunk to go with them. It's important that the trunks look like they thread through the volume of the tree. A lot of times you see trunk and then you see foliage behind it, and they don't really look like they belong together, like they're integrated into a tree. So keep in mind to thread the trunks and hide some trunks behind other shapes so it looks like a tree is in front, because aspen groves all share the same root system, and they're a volume that they fill, right? Oh boy, now we get to do the distant waterfall, and I'm gonna have some drier edges near the top of the waterfall, and then as the water takes its long fall and starts to mist, I'm gonna have some wet and wet or blended off edges to suggest the mist of the waterfall. I'll use some clear water backgrounds and some lifting to indicate the mist of the waterfall. When you use your brush to lift like this, it has to be clean and very dry. I press mine into the towel after it's been cleaned. And it's pretty much only good for a single stroke, and then you have to re-clean it and re-dry it. In watercolor, you have pigment and water, and things tend to flow where they are not. So you can have pigment and water on the paper and a very dry brush, and both pigment and water will flow up from the paper into the brush. Likewise, you can have pigment and water in the brush, and either dried wash or dry paper, blank, and pigment and water will flow from the brush to the paper. You can also have water flow into the brush and pigment flow to the paper, and vice versa. And so these are the 4 brush paper relationships. It's time for the most distant cliffs, and they're higher up and catching some of the early light. And so we're going to use warm colors and keep the values lighter. By value, I mean if you took a black and white photograph, the shade of gray for the distant cliffs would be a lighter shade of gray. Let's put the lower cliff in shadow, and this will increase the value difference at our center of interest to give more contrast there and draw the eye into the main trees. There's something happening that may not be obvious. When I charge the color into the wet background wash and it pushed it out of the way, it made a little edge of color of the cliff color. And so I want to paint up to that. I don't want to paint into the actual fingers of the background that the trees are created from. I'm going to soften the edges on the distant cliff to help with the illusion of distance. Less detail, less hard edges. We paint the trunks of the center of interest trees. These are going to be the widest trunks and probably have the most branches that spread out to the side. And remember to thread the trunks through the body of the tree to help it look more three-dimensional. I'm adding a grassy area behind the aspens, and I'm going to paint negatively around the trunks. Here's another reason that I used acrylic instead of Misket. When you make backgrounds like the trees are built from, Misket gets in the way of those backgrounds, and you just won't get a tree-like shape. It'll pull up along the border of the Misket. You can use gum arabic, but gum arabic can only survive 1 or 2 layers of painting before it gets dissolved back into the painting media. Now that I know where and what the trees look like, I'm ready to paint some reflections into the lake. I paint the lake shape with clear water, and I have pretty thick paint that I'm putting on. It looks too dark right now, but it won't stay that way. That layer of clear water is going to make its value less as it dries than it would have been. Okay, all the main shapes are laid in, but now I have some corrections. And this color of the sand and value are very similar to the distant cliff. And I really want to separate the sand from the distant cliff. Also, this more middle ground cliff, I want to separate that from the distant cliff as well, so it gets glazed with a more neutral, warm tone. I'm just going through fixing things. I miss reflecting a little piece of the sky, and there's probably no way to get that back, but I'm going to scrub the painting surface, stamp it, scrub it a bit, and try and get it a little lighter, and then I'll hit it with a blue. The lake is going to be, I'm just arbitrarily making the lake have more neutral tones than the actual landscape, because I don't want the reflection trees to compete with the center of interest trees. Okay, I'm entering the phase of the painting where I start to look at things and fix them, and one thing I see on the distant waterfall is the cliff to the left-hand side is much darker than the cliff to the right-hand side. So we need to fix that. So I'm going to get some darker colors in there. This is a little bit of clear water because I don't want any real hard edges. I want hard edges by the cliffs, but not by the water. So I wet by the water and leave it dry by the cliffs. And then we'll darken that side of the waterfall up, that side of the cliff up, so that it looks like those two cliffs are on the same plane. That small cliff protruding needs a little more definition, so I put that darker touches on its right-hand side. Now I'm going to lift some of the mist of the waterfall out of the wet paint that I just added. Looking around some more, I see the trees on the top of this middle ground cliff are way too light, and so I'm going to darken them up a bit. I have to make sure to keep their shape smaller than the next layer forward. But I'm going to indicate little tree shapes, and then I'll drop little accents of color into that little mini forest that's up there. I'm going to add some more volume to my center of interest trees and darken little crevices or whatever next to the trunks and start to show a little bit more form around those trees. I don't want to mess with them too much because I want the fresh background look of watercolor to be preserved. Now I'm adding a pop of color here to play off against the colors of the aspen tree. I've decided to add some taller evergreens next to the center of interest aspens. And so I'm laying those in, and I'll tilt the board and drop a variety of interesting colors into the wet shape of the evergreen tree and let them run down. It adds extra interest to kind of a well-known shape. Now I'm going to tilt my block of paper, and that will help some of these charged colors run. These are pretty fully saturated color, but as they meet with the wet dark neutral green, they'll be toned down quite a bit. So if I don't make them fully saturated colors, you won't even see them. And I'm going to need a second tree behind this one that I'll make a lighter shade of green, but we'll also run the colors down it as well. Here's some major running of the lighter yellow, which kind of turns into a yellow-green. The oranges and reds get muted and look like some of the dried out branches that sometimes the evergreens get. I'm adding some color accents and suggestion of bark to the center of interest trees. Now here we go with that evergreen partner, and I tilt the block again because I'm going to run color into that wet shape that we made. Another problem is the colors of the lake reflection are as bright or even lighter in value than my main center of interest trees. And so I'm going to glaze over the top of that with a light gray glaze. It's a very neutral gray, just enough to cut that color and value down a bit, so that it focuses our attention more on the center of interest trees. And now I'm going to add some white accents into the reflection. Nothing too accurate. It's kind of distorted. The reflected trees are longer than the actual trees, and that can happen when you have a small wavelets on the surface of the water. They tend to extend the reflection down, and it just works to, if I would have made those reflections the same size as the lakeshore trees, I would have been left with a bunch of space in the bottom with nothing really much to do with. And so I'm artificially making sure that I have some interest there, as well as suggesting the reflections of the main center of interest trees. Now my white trunks here have a lot thinner paint, and it's being painted into a wet background, and so these white accents will fade away and they won't be as strong as the main center of interest trees by the time they dry. I signed the painting when the reflection wash was wet paint, and I just used my sketch pencil for that. What happens when you do that on the damaged wet paper, it damages it and draws extra paint into it, and your signature is more permanent than it would be if you just painted it on. And so we're at the finished painting, and we'll zoom in, take a look at some of the features. There's the really wonderful backgrounds doing a lot of work. Here's some of the color that's flowing down the body of the tree. It really makes it more interesting than if you just painted the shape and left it. And the background trees came out quite nice. I enjoy them. They're very suggestive, very fluid for the watercolor. And I feel the reflection is in balance with the center of interest trees. Thanks for watching.